Can everybody hear me? Good morning, Boost. It is an honor, it is a pleasure for me to be with you this morning to share some ideas about what I think is perhaps one of the most profound opportunities to transform the ways in which we work with young people. And oftentimes we think that it's the curriculum or it's the book or it's the new tool or the new shiny evaluation. But more and more, my research and my experience tells me that it's really the transformation of our hearts that have an impact on the ability to transform our young people. So I am honored, I'm excited to be able to share these ideas with you today. I'm going to start differently today, this morning, because I kind of feel like I'm at home. So I'm going to ask everybody to put everything that's in your hand, your phones, put them on the table, and everybody stand up. Just stand up really quick. Everybody stand up. Everybody get up. All right, I'm going to count to 3, and I want you to clap one time on 3. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to count to 3. I want you to clap twice on 3. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to count to 3. I want you to clap twice and stomp your foot twice on 3. 1, 2, 3. I'm going to count to 3. I want you to clap 3 times, stomp twice, and clap once on 3. 1, 2, 3. All right, now everybody, I just want you to give me a round of applause. All right, let's go. Have a seat, have a seat, have a seat. All right, now that our minds are syncopated with our bodies. So I want to talk to you today about healing and the power of transforming the way in which we work with young people who have been exposed to traumatic experiences. So the 3 things I want to share with you today is, 1, what are the kinds of challenges? How do we think about the environments where young people live and work and play, and how might that environment have an impact on our own well-being, but also the well-being of the young people that we care about? The second thing is I want to give you a framework, a way to think about healing, and not just healing for young people, and not just healing for in a medical sense, but healing in a political sense, because healing is really the most radical act we can engage in social justice, because it confirms that we have the right to be well. So I want to share with you a framework to think about how to integrate healing in our work. And then lastly, I want to give you a challenge, right? And that challenge is and how you take care of yourselves. Because oftentimes as youth workers and those of us who work with young people, we have been trained to give. We have been trained to be there for young people, but we haven't oftentimes been given the permission, the opportunity, or the space to be there for ourselves. Our well-being is contingent upon the well-being of our young people. We can't heal young people if we are wounded. And so I want to give you a charge before we leave to figure out ways to support yourself. I want to start with a story. For those of you who heard me speak before, you may have heard this story, but I think that this story really sets the stage for understanding the power of healing and development. As a professor, I'm invited to speak mostly around college campuses and conferences, but I got an invitation to speak at a prison not far from my home about 6 years ago. And the email read something like this: Dr. Ginwright, there are about 10 men here in the prison that have read your first book called Black Youth Rising, and that book was about young people in Oakland. And the 10 men would love for you to come to the prison to share your thoughts about, growing up in Oakland. And they had a book club. So I had debated whether or not I would take their invitation. But it was a Saturday morning, and my wife she said, you can go, you don't have to go cut the grass and all that. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna go out to the prison. So I went out to the prison, and I don't know if you've ever been to a prison before, but they gave me 2 instructions. They said, make sure you bring your ID and you cannot wear jeans. And so I didn't wear jeans, and I got to the gate and showed them my ID. And the correctional officer said, Dr. Ginwright, yep, the reading group they're in the cafeteria. It's a little tricky to get to the cafeteria, so just follow the instructions, and you'll end up at the cafeteria where the men are waiting for you. So she opened the gate, and I went through the gate, and the first correctional officer said, the cafeteria is on the other side of the prison. Find the yellow line on the floor and follow the yellow line all the way to the end of the corridor. So there are a bunch of colored lines on the floor, so I found the yellow line and I walked all the way to the end of the corridor where I was met with another door. That door buzzed open, bzzz, and I walked through it and it shut behind me. Boom. And I was met with another correctional officer. And this correctional officer said, you're going to the cafeteria? I said, yes. And she said, just find the blue line on the floor and follow the blue line all the way to the end of the corridor. So I found the blue line, and I walked all the way to the end of the corridor where I was met with another door, and that door buzzed open. Bzzz, and I walked through it, boom, and it shut behind me. I was met with another correctional officer, of course, and this correctional officer said, you're almost to the cafeteria, Dr. Ginwright. Just find the red line on the floor, follow it all the way to the end of the corridor. So I found the red line, and I walked all the way to the end of the long corridor where I was met with a door. That door buzzed open, bzzz, and I walked through it, and it shut behind me. Boom. By the time the third door shut behind me, something had shifted inside of me. I began to feel the sense of incarceration and closure. I began to feel trapped, and I began to imagine what these men who I was about to speak to, how they must feel every day. And I began to imagine that they hadn't felt the warm sun on their face, that they hadn't hugged their children, that they hadn't smelled the fragrance of fresh rain on the ground, and I became deeply insecure. What the hell am I going to tell these men about their lives, about my work, about my research? And so the comments that I had prepared, I took my paper and crumbled it up, and I decided that whatever I was going to say was not going to be about my research. And so I was feeling deeply insecure as I began to walk closer to the cafeteria door. And I had no idea what I was going to say to these men. And so the correctional officer said, we're at the cafeteria, Dr. Ginwright. I'm glad you're here. And they opened the door, and I was shocked at what I saw in the cafeteria. I had anticipated about 10 men waiting for me, but rather than 10 men, there were over 200 men waiting for me in their orange jumpsuits. I was like, oh, wow, damn, I wish y'all would have told me, right? As I walked into the cafeteria, the men were excited to see me, right? One of the brothers walked up to me, I'll never forget it. His name was Crease. He said, Dr. Ginwright, I'm glad you're here. We're so glad you're here, man. I said, I'm glad I'm here too. He said, my name is Crease, and I've been in here since 1986. My heart sank. And another brother came up to me. He said, hey, man, my name is Greg, man. I'm from LA, man. I'm glad you're here, Dr. Ginwright. We read your book. Man, I've been in here since 1989. My heart sank. And one by one, the men came up to me and shared their name and the year they had entered this place. And so there were 200 men excited to hear what I was going to say, and I had no speech, y'all. I didn't have a speech. And so as they were sitting in the cafeteria in chairs, their plastic chairs, the correctional officers ushered me up to the stage and put me behind the podium without a speech. So rather than speaking from my head, I spoke from my heart. And I shared with them the challenges of raising an African-American boy in Oakland. And I shared with them my concerns about my aging parents and not knowing what to do. And I just talked to them, man, for like 45 minutes about what was going on in my life. And I spoke to them from my heart. And one of the things I said to them is that you are not whatever brought you here. And whatever you did, there's always a space for redemption and healing. And I hope that anything that I've said, and when you go back to your cells today, that you reflect on your ability to heal and redeem yourselves or redeem the lives or whatever brought you here, but you always have the capacity to heal. And so after the talk, I went down off the podium, and I was shaking the men's hands, and the correctional officers were ushering me out of the cafeteria, and they were thanking me for sharing my ideas. And as I was leaving the cafeteria, I heard this loud voice behind me. "Hey, Dr. G." I turned around, and it was a brother, and he was tall, man. I'm 6'3", and he was taller than me, so I was like, "What's up, man?" Right? He said, "Hey, man, I want to let you know that those words you shared, man, they really touched me. They really mattered a lot for me to hear. You share yourself like that." I'm like, "Man, I'm glad whatever I said to you or to the man, whatever I said, I'm glad it had an impact." He said, "No, man, I want you to understand. It's hard being in a place like this, and I've been in here since 1987. And because I'm so tall and I'm black, man, people think I'm a threat. They always try to test me, man, but I'm not, man. I'm really a teddy bear, bruh." And he said, last year, I got in a fight in here, man, because people are always trying to test me. And when I got in a fight, man, they cut me in my face. And he leaned down, and he had a scar on his face. I said, "Man, I'm so sorry to hear about that." And he said, "Yeah, man, it's tough living in a place like this, man, but there's something that you said that really resonated with me." He said that you always have the ability to heal. And he said, "There's something that I do every single day, man, that makes this place tolerable and allows me to heal." And I said, "Well, what is it that you do?" And he reached into his pocket really quick, and I got nervous. I was like, "What are you doing, man?" The correction officer said, "Man, it's cool, he's cool, right?" And he reached into his pocket, and he said, "What I do to heal every day in a place like this," and he pulled out a little bottle, and he opened the bottle, and he blew bubbles. And the bubbles floated over my head. My first thought was, did this big brother just blow bubbles in my face? And he said, "When I blow bubbles, man, it reminds me of when my daddy used to take me to the park. He used to put me on a swing. When I blow these bubbles, man, it makes me be a human again, and it makes me be able to live in a place or to be able to survive in a place like this." And as I drove home that night, I began to be very deeply curious about our bubble stories. What do we do in our lives to sustain ourselves? What stories, what practices do we engage in? What are our bubble stories? How do we create bubble stories for the young people that we work with? How do we create places for young people to heal in difficult, challenging situations? And when I began to think about that question, what are our bubble stories and what do we do to heal? I began to become deeply curious, and I began to ask people questions. I talked to youth development professionals in New York about their bubble stories. I talked to teachers in the Bronx and in Chicago, and I really tried to understand what do you do in your classroom, your after-school program, to really rupture and disrupt the toxic environments, the challenges, the violence that young people engage in. What do you do to create your own bubble story? And so what I learned is that oftentimes the environments where young people work and they live and they play, there's a challenge to healing. And I remember explaining this as I was writing my book to my mama. I said, "Mom, I'm writing a book about healing. And it's going to be this, it's going to talk about this." And I talked to these teachers, and I talked to these youth development professionals. And my mama from the South, in her brilliant way, she said, "Healing from what, baby?" And so when she said that, I was like, wow, I have to actually think about what are we healing from? And how do we think about the environments where young people work, live, and play so that we understand the consequences, or we understand the environments where young people live. So there's these challenges to healing. And so in the book, I document the ways in which youth development professionals and teachers really create these bubble stories, but they all said one thing. And they said that the neighborhoods, the schools, the environments where young people work and live and play are oftentimes a challenge. And oftentimes to create the kinds of supports that they have to have an understanding of not just that young people come as individuals to their program, but that the environment that they live is problematic. And so in the book I document these stories and these research. And the first thing I try to understand is, theoretically, how do we think about challenges to healing in our systems? And the first concept is a concept called social toxicity, and that young people and we work and live and play in a socially toxic environment. Research by James Gabarino says that social toxicity is like physical toxins. If you think about a physical toxin like asbestos and lead paint, if you have asbestos and lead paint in your apartment, in your home, or where you work, if you're exposed every single day to asbestos and lead paint, that physical toxin could eventually make you ill. And if you're not healed from that exposure to that physical toxin, it could actually become lethal. Well, James Gabarino in his research says that there are social equivalents to physical toxins. And social toxins are things like fear, anxiety, stress, shame, uncertainty. All of these things are deeply present in the environment and have a toxic impact on the well-being of young people and those that work with them. Except social toxins are invisible because we can't see them, we can't touch them, we can't smell them, but they're just as present. And so this notion of social toxicity is important because we have to understand that the environment that we're in is oftentimes has an impact on the quality of well-being for young people and for those that support them. Here's an example of social toxins. I remember the summer of 2016 and 2015. My own son, right, where accounts after account after account of African-American boys being shot by police officers, and police officers not being held accountable for their actions. I remember my son leaving the house in Oakland, California with his friends with his hoodie on. And I remember being very concerned, stressed, is my son gonna come home tonight? Because I know that the police or whoever sees my son don't see my boogie, my baby boy. And at 6'3", right, he may be seen as a threat. This is a form of social toxicity. Another form of social toxins, we know what's happening right now with immigration and the damaging impact of immigration on immigrant families that are coming to the United States, where families are being ripped apart, where families are not taking their children to school or to medical appointments or participating even in the census count. And we know that fear, that uncertainty that's happening in our immigrant communities is another form of social toxicity. And so this form of social toxicity we have to take into account into our youth development programs and to our work with young people. So here's a way that we can understand social toxicity, the ways in which social toxins influence us, and the ways in which social toxins influence the young people that we work with. This is an image of Mia. Let's call her Tia for today. So Tia has has a deep passion to transform the lives of young people across America. She works in a youth development program, and she wants to have a transformative impact on young people. But Tia is not aware of social toxins, and social toxins are like rain clouds. And these rain clouds, social toxicity is shaped by things like poverty, transphobia, patriarchy, racism, homophobia, othering, colorism, belonging. All of these issues form socially toxic rain clouds. And that social toxic rain cloud is different from regular rain because when the rain hits Mia, it doesn't just stay on top of her, it actually gets inside of her. But Mia is not aware that the toxic rain cloud is inside of her. The effect of white supremacy, the effect of heterosexism, the effect of othering are inside of Mia, and she's not aware of how that it's even there. And so the result of that is that exposure to social toxicity has an impact on Mia's ability to show up in a profound way for young people. And it has an impact at 3 levels. First, it has an impact at me at the individual level, but it also has an impact on those that Mia works with. If you think about teams or your organizations or communities at the interpersonal level, it has an impact on her relationships with others. But that social toxicity doesn't stop there, because it also has an impact on the institutions that we work in. And that toxicity then has an influence on the values, the practices, and the policies of that institution. And then the institution itself then produces its own form of social toxicity, and it goes back out into society, and it repeats itself. So our job as youth development professionals, our job as educators, our job for those who take care and want to transform the lives of young people is to transform this cyclical process of toxicity. And we call that healing. So there has been a lot of talk about trauma. And I'm going to go a little bit off script. And we've been trained, and I know my own training as a sociologist, I was trained to use the term post-traumatic stress disorder, persistent or post-traumatic stress disorder, which comes from a way of thinking about trauma, the impact of these issues on young people's lives. But I want to just say that we should refrain from using the term post-traumatic stress disorder. And I want to encourage you to use this following phrase: persistent traumatic stress environment. There's nothing post about the trauma that young people are experiencing. There's nothing. When we call it a disorder, we presume that the challenge is in the individual and not the environment, not the neighborhood, in the school, and so forth. So if we think about persistent traumatic stress environment, then we're able to name that the issues that need to be transformed are not stuck in young people, not just heal young people, but we have to think about the broader environment where young people live, work, and play. I was working in Oakland, working with a group of young people who had experienced deep trauma about 3 or 4 years ago. These are African-American young people. There were about 7 or 8 of them. They had experienced sexual abuse. They experienced homelessness, all sorts of violence, and it was a healing circle. But I was trained to provide trauma-informed approaches to these young people. And so I was trying to get them to understand the impact of trauma on their lives and what trauma does to their brains and so forth. And they were sharing their stories. And one of the young people, as they were sharing their stories, stopped in the middle of his storytelling and said, "You know what, Dr. Ginwright, I understand it's important for us to talk about the thing that happened to us, but I'm more than what happened to me. I'm not just my trauma." And when he said, "I'm more than what happened to me, I'm not just my trauma," it shifted me. Because what he was saying is that despite the fact that I live in a socially toxic environment and it has a traumatic impact on me, you don't have to define me by the worst thing that happened in my life. But we also have to understand that he didn't say this, but this is me filling in what he was saying, that there's more to me than just that trauma. And that we need an approach that acknowledges my trauma but heals me from it in ways that are asset-based and asset-driven. And so when he said that, I began to think more deeply about trauma-informed care, trauma-informed approaches. And as I've studied more and more about trauma-informed approaches, I recognize its limits. And trauma-informed care is important, but it's incomplete. And it's incomplete for these 4 reasons. The first reason that trauma-informed care is incomplete is that it doesn't acknowledge that trauma is experienced collectively, not just individually. That when African American and Latino youth experience trauma because of immigration or from the police, they experience that as a collective. That means I could go to New York, I could go to Chicago, I could go to anywhere in this country and ask young people about their experience with the police, and that's a shared collective experience, that shared sense of fear. And so when we shift from thinking about trauma individually and collectively, that means we have to have a collective response to trauma. The second is that, as I said before, that trauma-informed care doesn't acknowledge the root cause of trauma that exists in the environment, in the neighborhood, not the individual. right? And so while we have to understand trauma has an impact on behavior, has an impact on psychology, we also have to look at the neighborhood. We have to look at the conditions where young people work, live, and play. The third is that trauma tends to focus on coping with symptoms rather than healing from them. When we talk about symptomology, we say we want to provide you opportunities to reduce your anxiety, to reduce your anger, right? And while those are important, it doesn't always provide a healing platform for young people to think about their dreams, their hopes, their desires. And the last is that, my slide. There's one more slide, but I don't know what happened to it, y'all. And the last is that trauma-informed care tends to presume that the adult doesn't need to be healed, right? And that means that we have to think about healing as adults, that in order for us to provide profound healing opportunities, for us to provide the kind of supports that young people need, we also have to create supports for ourselves. That is, how do we begin to heal ourselves, to heal our own communities in the process of transforming the lives of young people? So we call that process healing, a shift from trauma-informed care to healing-centered engagement. And healing-centered engagement is a process that allows us to think differently about the utility of our programs and saturating young people with opportunities to heal from their exposure to social toxicity. I like to use this metaphor for healing-centered engagement. A friend of mine, I was explaining how the social toxins work and have an impact on the lives of young people and adults. And my friend is a botanist at UC Berkeley. And we always kind of switch stories and share stories with each other. And she said, you know what? There's actually this experiment that we do at UC Berkeley in my lab where we use toxic gas, and it's somewhat similar to what you're talking about, Shawn. And she said, we take these plants in my lab and we put them in these chambers and we pump different toxic gas into the chamber of these plants. And what we do generally is we try to see how the plant reacts, and oftentimes the plant dies. And I was like, oh, that's not what I'm talking about. She said, no, let me finish the experiment that we did. She said, one time, we didn't just take one plant and put it in the gas chamber. We took a community of plants. And we took those same plants and we put them in the same toxic gas chamber. We pumped it with different kinds of toxic gas. But this time, the plants, when we pumped the gas in there, when we put them in there, something miraculous happened. We had never seen it before. When we pumped the gas in there, the plants actually began to pull out different nutrients and chemicals out of the soil. And the plants began to sort of metabolize those nutrients differently. And the plants actually began to emit a gas in the chamber that cleaned up the toxic gas we pumped in. They detoxified their environment. They cleaned up the environment that they were in. I like to use that as a metaphor, right, for how we should be thinking about our youth development programs. That we need to create opportunities for young people to heal by detoxifying ourselves and detoxifying young people to their exposure to social toxins. And so when we talk about healing-centered engagement, there are really four things that I want you to think about. And that the first thing is healing-centered engagement is explicitly political rather than clinical. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is a clinical approach to healing presumes that you can just treat someone or some exposure to some form of harm. When we think of it politically, is we take in consideration the conditions that created harm in the first place. It builds agency. It builds the ability for young people to speak to the issues that impacted them. If you take, for example, March for Our Lives, young people having voice and agency about gun violence, Black Lives Matter, right? All of these issues where young people are engaged in, they're having a voice, is a form of healing because it's speaking to the conditions that created the harm. Now, this isn't just me that says this. The research suggests the same thing. Isaac Prelatinsky's research suggests that when young people are developing a sense of agency, political awareness, and engagement, that has an impact on their ability to have a sense of control over their lives. That sense of control contributes to well-being. And so when we call healing a political act, we have to think about the ability and the capacity for young people to respond in a way to address the issues that cause the harm in the first place. The second is healing-centered engagement is explicitly culturally grounded, and it views healing as a restoration of identity. And that means that we have to put identity at the center of our healing processes. I remember one of my own healing as a young person, as a child, was I grew up in a neighborhood where we hated being black. We would talk about our dark skin and our thick lips and our kinky hair, right? And that was reinforced by the commercials on television. Culture wasn't a part of the ecosystem and where I grew up. And so I had to unlearn my self-hatred around ethnic and racial identity. And so when we talk about culturally grounded, we have to put young people's identity and heal from that identity. Now, it's not just racial and ethnic identity. It could be gendered identity, right? It could be class identity. It could be any identity, but it means that we take identity and place it central in our work with young people. But it also means that we have to interrogate our own identities, right? What does it mean to be a white person working with a group of African American or Latino young people? What does it mean to be a Latino working with a group of white young people? It means that we can't presume that our identities don't matter, and that we have to create opportunities for young people to heal from the ways in which their identities have been harmed. Healing-centered engagement is asset-driven, and it focuses on the well-being we want rather than the symptoms we want to suppress. Right? So when we talk about trauma-informed care, it tries to reduce symptoms. When we talk about healing-centered engagement, it is dream-driven. That means that we talk about what are the dreams and aspirations young people want. What are the assets that they bring into our youth development programs? And we begin to create opportunities for them to have an imagination about their lives so that they can begin to move forward in a positive way. And lastly, healing-centered engagement supports the adults with their own healing. And as I said before, we can't presume that we can heal and support young people without our own healing as well. And so in our journey to provide profound youth development and healing, right, we have to begin to reimagine our work with young people. This is an example of a school in Stockton, California, where the principal, Kristen Buckingham, sent me this. So if you're from Stockton, she sent me this. Is Stockton in the house? So this is Kristen Buckingham sent me this picture when she had read an article I wrote, and she said we have 60% of our children that come to our middle school have some form of trauma. And the district sends one counselor every 2 weeks. In other words, the mental health need completely outweighed their ability to respond to it. And so she said we had to take healing seriously at my school. And so me and a few teachers got together. We found a room that we were just using for storage. And we made it into a spa. And she said we bought bean bags, we bought fragrances, we covered the lights so that it was soft colors, and she said that the only rule that they have for this room is that anyone in the school could use this room at any time. They just ask that they be quiet. And so a young person can come in the room and be silent, the teachers can come in there and be silent, or the administrative staff can come in there and be silent. But she said what happens is it becomes the epicenter of the school now. So that now when young people go back to their classroom, they can remember the feeling they had in this space. They can begin to reflect, right? They have a different way of thinking about. This is just a small example of how people are thinking about healing. This is another example of healing. This is a camp that we created called Camp Akili, where we said, you know what, young people don't oftentimes have the opportunity to be young people. How do you support play as a process of healing? And this is a process that we use as a color run. And so that the research suggests that when we are engaged in play, when young people are engaged in play, that playing actually becomes a healing modality. Lastly, We oftentimes, particularly for those of us who are teachers, don't have or build in opportunities for reflection. This is a retreat that we do for teachers, that we've done for teachers, where we provide the opportunity. We don't provide you with another curriculum or a textbook or another teaching method or another pedagogy. What we give you is the opportunity to rest and think and reflect on your practice, to go deep. Michael Funk has said, and I'm borrowing from Michael Funk, that oftentimes we are given a lens by which to see the world. And we see that the lens tells us that there's challenges, the lens tells us that there's racism, the lens tells us that there's classism, the lens tells us how to see the world. But we don't oftentimes given the opportunity to have a mirror. And so a shift from a lens to a mirror, and the mirror work is the interjourney, the reflection on who we are, the reflection on why we do what we do, the reflection on our own insecurities and our own traumas and the things we're still healing from. Oftentimes as youth development professionals and teachers, we don't have that space. And mirror work is probably one of the most important practices that we can engage in, but because it's so precious. But we don't oftentimes build that into our workspace. So this is an example of really taking seriously the healing of the adult so that they can learn to bring those practices back to their work with young people. So there are 5 principles of healing that I'm going to leave you with that I want you to think deeply about as we think about the healing-centered engagement. And the first when we think about healing, we have to think of healing on 3 levels. We have to heal ourselves, what are our own practices in healing. We have to heal our relationships, our engagement. For those of you who are, you know what I'm talking about, you may have, you could probably take an inventory of the relationships that you have in your life right now that are toxic. Like when you talk to that person on the phone, you go, oh, damn, right? You could take an inventory of the relationships that feed you. So the relationships that feed you and the relationships that drain you. So the second is we have to heal all of those relationships. And the third is transforming the institutions that oftentimes cause the harm in the first place. So healing at 3 levels, at the individual level, at the interpersonal level, and at the institutional level. And here are the 5 principles. We call it karma: culture, agency, relationships, meaning, and aspirations. And that if we practice these on an ongoing basis and integrate these practices into our work, integrate these practices into our lives, we begin to create a pathway for healing for young people and a pathway of healing for ourselves. Culture is really developing an awareness of our own humanity, of our ethnic, racial, and other social identities. It means asking who we are in this work. And it means that we interrogate our gender identities. It means that we interrogate our racial and ethnic identities. Second is agency, and agency is the ability to act. And as we've seen before, that agency, when young people can develop a voice to act, that contributes to their own sense of well-being. The third is relationships. And there are 2 kinds of relationships that we have. We are oftentimes trained in transactional relationships. And transactional relationships are those relationships that are a function of our titles. I am the director, you are the program manager. I am the program manager, you are the youth development specialist. I am the executive director, you are the program manager, whatever, right? It's a function of our titles, and while transactional relationships are efficient, they're not effective for healing. So we need to shift from transactional relationships to transformative relationships. And transformative relationships are relationships that are based on our humanity. It means that we can connect with each other based on our vulnerability, our ability to connect and share. Our transformative relationships are relationships that are based on our ability to connect at a human level. Meaning means shifting from always asking ourselves how. How do we have a better impact with young people? How do we have create a better program? To shifting from how to why. And that why means, why am I doing this? What is the meaning that I get from this work? And how is that meaning actually supporting and fueling my impact with young people? And the last is aspirations. And aspirations means that we have to develop and cultivate the ability to dream beyond the problems we have in America. And that if we don't cultivate the ability to dream beyond them, all we do is engage in remedial social change. And remedial social change is insufficient. What I mean by our ability to dream is that we have to cultivate our ability to imagine another way of being. If you think about all of the challenges we have, right? None of these challenges can be solved without an imagination about a greater solution. So our aspirations are significant and important in our ability to heal ourselves and to heal young people. Very quickly, here are 4 points around thinking about healing-centered engagement. We need to increase organizational supports to integrate healing practices into our day-to-day engagement with young people. How do we actually have meetings? How do we begin activities with young people? We need to build the capacity for the adult staff to strengthen their own healing and well-being and attend to the social, emotional, and spiritual well-being of the adults and the young people. Yes, I use the word spiritual, not in a religious sense, but in a sense that we have questions about why we're here. We have things, everyone in here in this room is dealing with something. And the ability to have that, to fold that into our work allows for us to have different kind of conversations and connections with young people. Third is assess the organizational readiness to use healing-centered engagement, right? How ready is your organization to engage in a healing-centered strategy? And then start with small rituals, not transforming the entire organization, but small things make a big difference. I want to end with a quote by Michelle Alexander, who for me is the most brilliant legal mind of our time. And Michelle Alexander, 2 years ago, she wrote a book called The New Jim Crow, which documented the new form of slavery. And Michelle Alexander spent her whole career with legal brilliance. And 2 years ago, she said, "I'm not practicing or writing about law anymore." Because she said that the fundamental questions in America cannot be transformed just by legal responses. And she said she stopped practicing law and she enrolled in the Union Theological School. And she said that this is not simply a legal problem. The challenges of America are not simply a legal problem or a political problem or a policy problem. At its core, America's problems raise profound moral and spiritual questions about who we are, who we aim to become, and what we're willing to do now. I want to thank you for this opportunity to share these ideas with you, and I want to challenge you to go heal our country and heal our young people. For those who are interested in learning more about healing, we are having a masterclass on healing-centered engagement where you can learn how to deepen these practices. So if you're interested in that, you can go to our website at flourishagenda.com and sign up, and we'd be happy to enroll you in our masterclass. Thank you very much.